Hey boys and girls, Square One Art is our next project. We will create artwork that is a square rather than a rectangle. I'll mail those artworks away, and later we'll have the option to order products with your image on the product. Here is a coaster for keeping your table protected. There are stickers. There's tiles. You could order a mouse pad with your artwork on it, and there are a lot more products available to order. Today, let's focus on creating something wonderful that can be reproduced by Square One Art for a fundraiser. The fundraiser will allow us to buy more and better art materials. Here's the finished result of my Analogous Color radial design, these flowers that come radiating out from the middle, creating repeated shapes that come away from the middle. It wasn't too tricky for me to draw this with the Sharpie, and then the watercolor paint that covered over top did not hide the black line. I'm pretty happy with it. I like the way that the analogous colors blend and bleed together without fighting and creating a muddy brown mess. I've still got some orange. I've still got good colors. So this is going to be my project. I learned about repeating lines to create a pattern, and I learned about wet into wet watercolor technique that made our colors bleed into one another. And I learned about the color theory, analogous colors, which are neighbors on the color wheel. Let's get started. We will begin with a black Sharpie. The Sharpie is permanent, and it's got a very nice point. We're going to do some thin line drawings of flowers. It may not be a flower to you, or may feel like it is a flower. That's great. If you don't want to make a flower, make something else, but we're concentrating on radial design. That means it comes from the middle and goes away from the middle. And we'll have 5, 6, maybe 7 different radial shapes around our paper. If you need help, these drawing guides will be available. What we'll do is we'll start in the center with a circle or a dot and make one shape that goes starting from the middle out and back. And then we'll repeat that shape and repeat that shape and repeat that shape. And then it just grows from there in layers. This is how we see a lot of things in nature. So I will begin with a black dot that is not in the middle. And I'm going to try and make a shape. And I'll repeat that shape on the other side of my black dot. And then I'll go around like this. Now I'm going to repeat that shape again, but I'm skipping some. I'm skipping in order to show overlapping. You recall overlapping, how the things in front cover over the things behind them. Now I'll make the same shape, and it's coming away from the middle. Maybe it'll help me to turn my paper. So I have 3, and maybe I'll give it 2 more. This next one I'll do is just a spiral, very simple, starting from the outside, and I'll come in. No, I'll start from the inside. I'm feeling very loose. I'm going to come off the paper. Now here's the part I want you to see. I'm going to connect from the middle of that spiral and double it up. And one last tiny one. I found it much easier to turn my paper as I created these designs than to draw the same shape upside down. As I repeated the shapes, I kind of got into the rhythm of it and enjoyed myself. Notice I left a little space between these flowers. We will be coloring in that space soon enough. I'm going to transition to painting by adding some water, a paintbrush, paper towel, and some colors. Now this is a pan of watercolor paints. We'll be using analogous color schemes here, which means colors that are close to each other on the color wheel. If you've got a nice set of paints, they should be arranged like those on the color wheel. So next to yellow, we should have orange and green. Next to this light blue, we should have an indigo or a green. Now these 3 colors would be analogous. These 3 colors would be analogous as well. You don't want to skip around your paint palette too much, or your colors will not be analogous. If I wanted to go with this violet, its neighboring colors would be indigo and around to the top, the red violet. So we have a violet, a blue violet, and a red violet, all going next to each other on the color wheel. What I'll do first is I'll pick a main color to paint one flower. I'll choose to paint this spiral first, and I'm going to just add water to the whole shape. The paper we're using today it's not designed for watercolor paint, so it can't handle a lot of water, but it can handle a little. You'll notice the Sharpie is a permanent marker, and it's not bleeding when I get it wet. If we used Crayola markers, they would be bleeding. For this spiral, I'm going to put down this light blue color first. So I have to wake up that dry paint by adding water and tickling it until that becomes awake. Now I'm loading my paintbrush with the paint, and since the paper's wet, the paint will spread. We could try and stay in the lines, but it's not too important for this project because we're going to be using wet paint into wet paint. And that analogous color scheme is going to be really a nice effect here. So while the paper is still wet, I'm going to choose green, which is next to the blue, and I'm going to drop some green in here in places. And I'll add a little green out here as well. Wherever the paper is wet, the paint will try to travel, but where the paper is dry, the paint will not flow there. you might have thought I'm out of indigo paint, but I have enough if I activate that paint with a little bit of water. Now I've got some dark blue, and I'll drop that in a couple of places as well. I'm not worried about those marker lines because they will show up when this paint is dry. And the way these blues and greens work together, those analogous colors, make a really pretty effect. I'd like to talk about analogous colors for just a moment. Analogous colors are colors that are next to each other on the color wheel, and they're like neighbors. So red, orange, and violet are all analogous colors. They are neighbors, red being in the middle. So I'm going to use analogous colors on my flowers. I've got to choose which color will be in the middle, and then what other colors I'll use. The next one I'd like to paint will be red-violet is my middle color. Its neighbors are red, and then if you went all the way around the color wheel, you would come to violet on the right-hand side. So red-violet, red, and violet. Because this is not watercolor paper, I need to act fast with the water that's on this paper. Wherever the water is placed, the color goes there. It's also called a water mask from time to time. Telling the paint where to go. It's called masking. You might have heard of masking tape. I like to watch that color spread. Not worrying about the marker lines right now. I am being careful to clean my brush before I go to the next color. If you're watching, you'll see these colors bleed into one another. So there's not a big difference, or there's not a hard line between my red violet and my red. They're bleeding together. It's one of those magical things about watercolor paint, that it would bleed so beautifully. One more drop of purple just right in here somewhere. Wet into wet. I can see a little white, and I kind of like that. It shows the paint well. Nervous. Now I need to think about the space between these flowers. I think I'll use some liquid watercolor to paint blue between the flowers. And then I'll drop in some analogous colors to blue as I want to. Here's a container of liquid watercolor, and it's blue, but it's been watered down a bit, so it's a pretty thin color. It will definitely show the lines on the paper. I'm going to be careful this time not to let this blue merge with other colors. And since this paper is wet, I'm going to avoid it for a few minutes while I paint the rest of my outside, my negative space. I'll paint that negative space first. And remember, while the paint is wet, I just added some water. While the paint is wet, we can drop in some analogous colors to bleed into this blue background. So I'm going to use this blue here and just drop it in and let that paint bleed and have a real soft effect. That change in color is going to look nice. Even maybe green, a drop of green here and there might blend and mix and look pretty. I'll do a little more water masking to make sure my blue and green does a good job of bleeding. Please remember, when your paper is wet, it is very easy to tear. So we want to be careful and handle our art flat while it's very wet like this. We want to keep it flat on the table. Don't pick it up to show your neighbor across the room, or you might end up with a tear or a hole because your paper is easier to tear when it is wet. I've got a hard line here and I want to be sure the colors blend.